All right, thank you, Casey, and thank you everyone for sticking it out to the end of the day. This is my first WhaleFest, so I'm really excited to be here and to get to meet everybody in the community and just to really get immersed into talking about marine science. So before I get into too much of my research, I wanted to start with an acknowledgement that science is a team sport. A little bit of feedback. And so everything I'm going to talk to you about today is from a big group of collaborators. There's lots of people that contributed to it. And so I just want to acknowledge all of their contributions. Let's see if I can move this. Okay. So my story starts a long time ago, but maybe not in a galaxy too far away. I grew up in the Midwest, so about as far from the ocean as you can get. I didn't actually even see the ocean until I was 20. But I was always very, very fascinated with it. I was just immersed in wanting to know more about our oceans. And so you can imagine my excitement when I got that email telling me, right out of undergrad, that I got a research internship at the Alaska Sea Life Center. So I was going on an adventure, leaving the Shire, and I was joining a project where we were interested in these guys, harbor seals. Similar to the questions that you have here in Southeast, we were interested in understanding why these populations had declined, whether they were recovering, what the threats were, all of those different questions. My job was very important. I was a professional seal counter. There are 66 seals in this picture, 67 if you count this guy. And that kind of information, understanding the number of seals or the number of any organism in an environment, is important for conservation management. It's how we know how healthy a population is doing. If it's recovering after a decline, or if there's some early warning signal in the number of animals that tells us that something's happening in the ecosystem that we may want to be aware of. When I was counting, we were just counting the total number of seals using these spaces, but occasionally when we do these types of studies, we break it down into other categories. So we might look at the number of males and females that were in that population. And that's because we know from a lot of different studies that they have different behaviors, they utilize different spaces, they might have different food resources, so it might be important to consider them differently when we're assessing that population. We also sometimes break them down into adults and juveniles, because again, they have very different strategies. Juveniles are still developing some of their physiological capacity, whereas adults may not be. And so sometimes we break it down by that age group. But that's usually where most of these kind of studies end. So it's these kind of either gross population, all the seals are the same, or we just kind of break them into one or two other groups, and within those groups, all the seals are the same. While I was doing this work at the Sea Life Center, a new area of research was starting to become more and more popular. And we heard a little bit about it yesterday, and it was the research into the concept of personalities. Now, when I first heard about this research, it set off every warning bell, because if there was one thing that all of my mentors, research professors, everyone had told me was that the first rule of animal behavior science is you do not anthropomorphize. The second rule was that you do not anthropomorphize. Anthropomorphizing is attributing human emotions or traits to animals. So saying that seal looks scared or it looks nervous or things like that. And so when I first heard about this area of research kicking up, I was like, this might be a little bit of a slippery slope. I'm not quite sure what this means or how it would be helpful. But the more I dug into it, the term personality was used more to make it kind of translatable to the public, but it left a little bit of gray area that's actually where the core of the research is. And that's when we're talking about personalities broadly in animal behavioral science, we're talking about consistent individual behavioral differences. So amongst a group of females or amongst a group of males, individuals have a set of behaviors that they do that's consistent. And that means that over time, this is a very kind of schematic drawing, you've got an individual that's this blue dot, and at time 1 or context A, it performs a behavior in a certain way, and that's consistent at all the other time points and all the other contexts. And so that's what we're really talking about when we're talking about this personality, this consistent individual differences. And so after I left Alaska, I did my PhD, kind of focusing on a mating system where we were starting to actually tease into whether marine mammals had personalities and what that meant in the big picture. And specifically, we were interested in focusing on maternal behaviors. So yesterday, we talked a little bit more about it in terms of male albatross. Now we're going to dig into the mom side of the story. And pinnipeds are great for looking at these questions of maternal strategies, because within the two primary groups of pinnipeds, we're going to ignore walrus for a little bit, we have our phosid seals, which are our true seals, harbor seals, ice seals, and then we have our otariids, which are our sea lions and fur seals. Phosid seals will nurse their pups for as short as 4 days before they're weaned, and usually up to about a month, whereas otariids will stay with their pup for a year or 2 years. Also, phosid seals, while they're nursing their pup, are fasting. So all of the resources that they're giving to their offspring are what they have when they start doing that nursing process. Whereas with otariids, they go out to sea, they can forage, they come back and nurse their pup, and they do that over and over and over again. And so I did most of this work now in a galaxy far, far away, over in England, in Scotland, and we were working with the gray seal breeding system. Because this is a pinniped that we don't have here in the Pacific. It's found just in the North Atlantic. We'll go a little bit into just the general gist of their breeding season and what happens, and then talk a little bit about why this concept of consistent individual behaviors is important. So the breeding season starts with these guys, the males. They show up on the beaches about this time of the year in Scotland, so kind of late October, early November. And they show up, and their goal is to find a spot on the beach that they think females are going to want to be at, because their goal is to be there when they're ready to mate. These guys are also fasting while they're on shore, so they have an energy balance question. They have to decide if they're going to spend all of their time and energy hunkering down and holding that spot, or defending it from other males. And so when they do decide to defend it from other males, it can get into these pretty intense fights. They're not very graceful. These are two males at the very beginning of the breeding season, so you can see they're still kind of in their chunky phase. That's considered a fight. They can get bloody, but most of the time they're not doing these big energetic activities, because again, that's using a lot of energy. And if the breeding season is lasting 6 weeks, they may not be able to make it the whole time if they're spending all their energy fighting other males. But if they're successful, they are there when the females go into estrus, and then they can mate with them, and they can do that throughout the whole breeding season. So an individual male may have multiple mating events. But what about the mums and the pups? So they show up. The mum will be on shore for maybe a day or two before she gives birth to a pup. So this is a video of a female giving birth. She checks out her pup. And so for gray seals, once they've given birth, they will nurse their pup for about 15 to 18 days. So still a relatively short amount of time. But in that time, the pups go through a very dramatic transformation from that skinny little guy that you see there to these big butterballs. Yep, I know, I get all the cute pictures. So it's not always just the mum and the pup, though, on the colony. These colonies are crazy. There's lots of mums. They're all giving birth to pups. They're messing around in mud and tide pools. There's males careening through the colony, fighting each other. And so it could be a pretty chaotic, stressful environment. And so if you remember, we said these females are fasting for that whole 15 to 18 days. And so they have a finite amount of resources, and they have to essentially allocate that to different activities. So in one case, they're actually trying to keep themselves still alive. But in terms of their pup, they have to decide if they're going to do more of these defensive behaviors, so defending it from other females that are nearby, from those males that are crashing through. The male trampling actually does account for a somewhat significant amount of the pup deaths that we see on these colonies. So there may be some strategy to expending some of that finite amount of energy if it defends your pup. But again, all that energy that you're using in defense now means you can't convert that into milk that then helps your pup grow into that nice chubby guy that we saw on the previous slide. So now that we know about the system, how do we start studying the behavior of gray seals to answer some of these questions? Gray seals are excellent for these long-term studies where we follow individuals over time because they have naturally identifiable markings on their fur that does not change throughout their life. It actually is consistent all the way from when they're pups to adulthood. And so you can see here, this is a male his markings are very clear, mostly along his body. The females, we use some of their markings on their body as well as on their neck. And so that means that not only can we go up to the animals, identify them, and weigh them so that we can actually calculate some of those energetic costs of how much weight the mom had at the beginning of the season versus how much weight she had at the end of the season. That tells us how much energy she used for all of her activities. We can also weigh the pup at the beginning of the season and the pup at the end of the season when it's weaned and know kind of what that efficiency was from mom to pup, how much got lost to other things. But these natural markings mean that we could do a lot of these observations completely hands-off. We can do it. A lot of my PhD was spent sitting in a little wooden box on a cliffside in Scotland watching seals and taking really detailed behavioral notes. So again, the key to the behavioral study is having clearly defined definitions of what behaviors we're looking for so that it can be consistent and repeatable over time. So one that's very easy to define is vigilance or alert behaviors. It's where a seal lifts its head from rest and is scanning the environment. And so we were wondering, do these individual seals show some consistency and some variation across individuals in the amount of time that they spend vigilant? Remember, this is what we're looking for, this nice one-to-one line where if an animal has a low amount of vigilance, it always has a low amount of vigilance, versus if it has a high amount of vigilance, it always has a high amount of vigilance. And what we found was for males on the left and females on the right, this pattern seemed to hold up, that there were some individuals that spent less time vigilant and some individuals that across 2 different years, so the x-axis is either 1988 or 2009, and the y-axis is 1989 or 2010. So that's across 2 breeding seasons. They had the exact same kind of strategy for how much time they spent alert. But what about maternal behaviors? That's what we were interested in. So there's another behavior that gray seals do, which is a pup check, or kind of a maternal vigilance. Again, the pups are mobile, but they tend to stay kind of near the female, and so this behavior is a female, again, lifting her head up, but doing a specifically directed check at her pup. And for any of the moms in the audience, if you've ever been in a crowded grocery store or a crowd, my mom always said that she would do the duckling head count to make sure all 4 of us were within sight. It's kind of similar to what we see here, the females lifting their head and just making sure that they have eyes on their pup. This again was consistent, and we found that across 2 different video focals, taken one at the beginning of the breeding season and one at the end of the breeding season, females exhibited the same amount of these pup check vigilance behaviors. And it didn't matter if the pup was male, which are the blue triangles, or female, the red circles, or if the pups were more mobile or not. This was just something more inherent about the individual female that seemed to be consistent over time. But remember, we said that these consistent individual differences can be consistent over time or across context. So this has all been described so far about females when they're just at rest, when they're just chilling out on the colony. But what about if we add a stressor in? What if we had something that's a stimulus? How do they respond to that? And so yesterday we saw a little bit about a cow on a stick. I'm going to introduce you to Rocky, our remote-controlled vehicle. Rocky was designed to be able to present a very standardized stimulus to the seals in a way that we weren't part of the equation. So we could drive Rocky up to a seal, we would leave it there for a period of time to let the seal acclimate to it. It had a little GoPro on the top, but the most important thing was it had a speaker attached to it that could play stimulating sound to the animals that was something that would potentially startle them, but it wasn't completely going to freak out the entire colony. So here's 2 examples. We'll start with the female on the left. So her pup is behind her, and she had no response. No pup checks, no alert, just kind of shifted her head a little bit. Now we'll go to the female on the right. What are you? Wait a minute, where's my pup? There it is. Nice little pup check behavior. Still checking out this weird thing. So testing it over time, seeing how she responds the second time. Pup check and back. So again, we're doing a standardized stimulus that they get the same way every time, and we're quantifying a specific behavior that's very identifiable. So the number of times they pup check when they've been given this stimulus. And again, what we found was that this is very consistent. There's some females that when they're exposed to Rocky, they just don't seem to care. They're not reactive, they're not responding to it, versus there's other females that have a much higher rate of pup checking when they're given this stimulus. And then if we look at that difference of how they're checking their pup when they're resting versus how they're checking their pup when they're under this kind of stressful stimulus, we can look at how much that changed, if it changed a little bit or if it didn't change at all. And we start to see that there's some individuals that seem to be more fixed or unresponsive, so they don't have a lot of change. Whatever they're doing, they're going to do whether they're stressed or they're resting. But there's other ones that they may have very low pup checks when they're resting, but once they have that stimulus, they crank it up. They are checking their pup, they're flexible, and they're responsive to their external environment. So we got this far with our research, and then we started realizing that there might be some limitations to only using behavioral observations. So this is an example of a chance occurrence that when we were on the colony, we had a couple of seals with heart rate monitors on them. And one of the other researchers flew a drone over the colony. So that's this event here in green. And we saw that right at the start of the drone taking off, all the seals basically became alert. Our seal with the heart rate monitor became alert, but then very quickly went to rest and was resting for this whole amount of the black period here. However, you'll notice that physiological response lasted a lot longer. So even though behaviorally they looked like they were resting, their heartbeat was still going. It was still responding to that initial stressor. So we wanted to see if there was something about the physiology that was also consistent with this behavioral pattern that we were seeing. So enter Fitbit for seals. These literally were human kind of heart rate trackers that were modified, what you would use to measure your exercise at the gym, that were modified to be fit to these seals so that we could monitor both their heart rate and their heart rate variability over time. And heart rate variability is just that measure. If you've ever seen a EKG electrocardiogram, you see that there's the peaks between your heartbeats, and that time between beats is the period that we're looking for, the R to R interval. And how variable that is over time tells you a little bit about kind of their neurology and their physiology. And we can get into more if you want to later, but just know that that's kind of the two ways we can look at their physiologies, either their heart rate itself, whether it's accelerated or not, and also that interval between heartbeats. And so once we did this, we had the seals do all the same things. We observed their behaviors, we exposed them to Rocky trials, and we found that, again, seals were very consistent in their underlying physiology. So they either had very low heart rate variability, HRV, or higher heart rate variability. Cool story. What does this all mean? What are the risks and rewards to having either these consistent behavioral patterns, or why does it matter in terms of their physiology, whether their heart rate is low or high over time? So again, if we think about these kind of two groups that we're now seeing, that within these breeding females, they're not all the same. Even though they're all the same sex and they're all the same age class, we have some females that are consistently more fixed, unresponsive, and have low heart rate variability, and some that were more reactive, meaning that they were more flexible and responsive to their environment, and they had higher heart rate variability. Well, studies showed that females on average that were proactive tended to have larger pups, and females that were reactive on average tended to have smaller pups. This makes sense from what we were talking about before, but again, no strategy is perfect. Those reactive pups are likely smaller on average because, again, females have that finite amount of energy, and so if they're reacting to everything, they're escalating from rest to stimulus. That could be anything from another female near them, another male, a seagull flying overhead. They're using a lot of their energy that then could go to the pups. The trade-off, though, is that sometimes that energy needs to be expended. There might be a male charging through the colony that the female, it's either have a smaller pup or have a dead pup. And so the strategy in that case, it's not perfect, but it works. Now you might be thinking, okay, proactive though seems like it's pretty good. You just chill all the time, you have big fat pups, which means that they probably have a higher survival. We might expect the whole population to eventually just be proactive. It seems like the better strategy. Then there's this thing about environmental variation. There's no context that's completely stable all the time that just having one fixed response is going to be good for. And that's what we're seeing more and more with when we're thinking about climate change and climate change vulnerability, is that vulnerability and thus resilience is highly dependent on adaptive capacity. So how well individuals can respond. And this goes from animals to human societies. How adaptive are we to the challenges that we're facing? And how adaptive can we be to things that we maybe have never faced before? If you have a very fixed strategy, you may not be able to match your environment. Whereas if you have a reactive and flexible strategy, you may spend more energy over time, but again, you're able to respond to that environment and not have a complete kind of catastrophic event of maybe losing your pup in the case of the seals. And so we're moving forward in this research, looking at things like, okay, not just females, but how are individuals different in how they forage? We have generalist and specialist foragers. So ones that will basically eat anything that kind of comes near them and is hanging out in the general environment, or ones that are very, very fixed on a specific food resource. Well, what happens if that food resource isn't available anymore? What if we have something like happened in the marine heat wave where one of the primary forage fish in the region, capelin, either had massive die-offs or moved their distribution and now are harder to get? Which individuals, the ones that are flexible or fixed, are going to be able to deal with those changes in their environment more easily? We also can look at more of the physiology questions. So marine mammals, they're divers, they have some constraints. They can only dive for so long before they have to come up for air. Where are they at now in terms of their physiology, and how much adaptive capacity do they have left to respond to new changes in their environment is an area of research that we're moving into in the future. So I hope this all kind of just gives you the idea that diversity of behaviors is really important for wild populations and in general as we face some of these changing environmental questions. And so this research, again, was from what I did a while back when I was in the UK, still moving some of those themes through the research that I'm doing now. And I hope that it helps you realize that when you're out there looking at seals, the goal isn't to think that one's cute or one's happy, but to recognize that they are individuals and that how those individuals respond to us and how we respond to them is going to shape how we all can kind of use the ecosystem moving forward. So thank you for sticking out to the end of the day, taking your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Amy. We have time for questions, and we're going to do the same old routine, so raise your hands if you got them.
Hey, thank you. Wonderful talk. And I was just curious about the heritabilities of these behaviors, and if you looked at that, and if there's any learned aspect of this from the mothers, and if you get matings between a reactive versus a chill individual, would that produce individuals in the middle of the gradient?
So that's actually a huge area that we're just starting to kind of get to the tip of the iceberg. And gray seals might be one of the systems that it's really interesting to look at those questions. So there are some studies that are showing that there's a heritable component to this. However, there is also that kind of nature versus nurture of whether you're growing up in a very stressful environment, are you predisposed to being more reactive or not? And so with gray seals, because the pups stay with their mom for that set 15 to 18 days, and then they're weaned, well, the next part of the story is that the pups actually stay on the colony on land for about another 20 days, just roaming around in basically weaned pup gangs. It's really fun when you're trying to get to your hide and there's just a stack of weaned pups, blocking your way. But the fact that they're still there and they're still accessible for researchers would be a good study system for being able to determine, okay, what were their behaviors when they were with their mom, and then what does that look like when they transition to independence? And so there are some studies that are starting to look at that and to see, does it change over lifetime? Because that idea of a consistent behavior being consistent across contexts can be within a life stage. So it could be that they're more reactive as a pup, but then they change to be more proactive as an adult. So we're not sure when it becomes fixed in their life history yet and how much of that has to do with genetics versus the environment. But it's a really exciting area of research.
I guess following up on that question, very similar style question, like, have you guys been able to find a correlation generationally, like certain offspring of mothers that become mothers themselves exhibit the similar characteristic?
So on these colonies, they're really interesting because they are part of a long-term study where we're actually going back to the same females, in some cases, all the way back to kind of the early 2000s, because the study itself has been going on since about the mid-80s. The pups, however, don't always come back to the same colony. There is some site fidelity that we would be able to do that, and we do flipper tag the pups. You may lose a flipper tag over life, just tootling around on rocks and stuff like that. But right now, also with the generational time, so they don't come back to breed until they're about 4 to 6 years old. So now these studies were all from 2016, so we're right at about the stage where some of the pups that we had in the early stages of the study might be coming back, and we would be able to look at some of those questions. So.
Did you see any difference in survivability of pups between reactive and proactive moms?
Mm-hmm. So the survivability question is similar. So to understand survivability, we have to be able to track that pup throughout the rest of its life. And they go through this kind of juvenile dispersal stage, where after they're weaned, they spend their 20 days on the island working off all that fat so that when they get into the water, they don't just bob around at the surface. And then they're kind of just being juveniles. The juvenile stage for most marine animals is considered the lost years. We don't have a really good handle on what a lot of juveniles do because they're not reliably coming back during the breeding season. They're more dispersive, so especially males tend to travel much farther distances, and so being able to track survival during that time is tricky. Now that all said, there are some correlations between pup size and survival. So those pups that are bigger because they are on average, the pups that are on average bigger from the proactive mothers might have an increased survivability. But again, that would be something that we'd have to tease out kind of, is that a short-term survivability or is it a long-term? Because that reactive strategy might give you survivability on the colony if you're being protected from other rampaging females and males. But long-term, what are the trade-offs? And that's ecology as a whole it's all trade-offs. Oh yeah, so the first 18 days. So that's where kind of that energy mismatch could have more of a direct effect. So if a female expends too much energy too quickly, then she may decide to just abandon her pup and go back to sea because she needs to take care of herself and she needs to eat, she's been fasting as well. So there's some trade-offs there where if there's a behavioral mismatch where they spend too much energy responding to too many different things, it could have a detrimental effect on the pup. But on average, we didn't see any differences in survival. Yeah.
First of all, excellent talk. Really enjoyed it. I am curious, watching that video where the female was vigilantly approaching Rocky.
Yes.
I was wondering if perhaps that could be maybe an aggressive behavior. Have you ever considered that? And if so, how do you rule it out or confirm it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we saw a little bit of that with the albatross yesterday. And so there is this question within the animal consistent individual differences or personality world of this bold-shy axis where the more bold animals tend to be more aggressive and they're more kind of moving forward versus the quote-unquote shyer animals are more non-responsive. We chose not to focus on that aspect of it because it is really hard to quantify. And again, it gets you into that gray area of anthropomorphizing and potentially not being able to be repeatable. So we were interested in, again, more if they were just amping up kind of their vigilance in terms of responding to their pup. Now, there's a couple ways we talked about doing it. We could talk about, how many body lengths did the female move? So did she actively approach Rocky versus not? Because that's an energy cost. And one of the PhD students who followed me was able to quantify that a little better by putting, in addition to those Fitbits, she put accelerometers on the seals. So the same things that are in your phone that let it know if it's facing upwards or you turned it that way and then the whole screen turns too. You can put those on seals and get an idea of their movements. And then you can use that to help quantify behaviors because, again, it's more repeatable, it's more quantitative. So you could say, yes, their accelerometry tells us that they were doing this, and use that to help break apart the behaviors. Oh no, Maggie.
Thanks, Amy, that was great. I noticed on some of your videos, clearly some of the animals have been handled.
Mhm.
They've got things attached to them.
Sure.
Were you able to look at, or did you find any effect of the handling on whether they were more vigilant?
That is, so the interesting thing about this is that all of the animals in our study have been handled. Some of them have been handled for multiple years, whereas some haven't been. But regardless of that duration, whether they were a new female to the study or an older female who'd been in the study for many years, handled twice a year, their consistency was locked in. So whether they were more reactive or less or more proactive didn't matter whether they had been in the study or not. So that was something that was really kind of interesting to see, that it didn't seem like they were habituating to us as researchers, that their behaviors were actually locked in terms of this contextual format. And that's actually where some of these ideas started. Anyone who's worked on a seal colony, they don't look like they can move fast on land, but man, they will go after your ankles. They're feisty. And there's some females that as you're walking through the colony, you're like, don't go near here. She's gonna like charge you. She's gonna try to attack you. But you know you can walk by that female because you just start to observe those things. And so I think that's what I really like about integrating behavioral and physiological ecology, is because a lot of the questions we come up with are from our observations, are from going out into nature and making those observations and just saying, oh, why is that animal doing that? And then following through on the question, or why am I seeing these two different patterns? And then following through on the question. So.
You said that the males come to shore and wait for the females, and then the females will come to shore and breed or have their babies.
Mm-hmm.
After they've weaned their babies, do they go right into breeding, or do they get a break?
Nope. That's a great question. So a lot of my research was actually on the male contests, but yeah, from the female's perspective, basically anywhere between kind of day 15 and 18, she'll go into estrus. It's for a very short period of time. And so whichever male is there right when she goes in estrus is usually the one that manages to copulate with her. And so that's why those males are constantly fighting, because they want to be the one that is there in this very short window. And so then the female will sometimes still nurse her pup for another day or two, but sometimes it's just right at the end. She'll wean her pup and kind of as she's leaving, mate, and then head to sea. No breaks.
Yeah, did you study the correlation between the age of the mother and her reactivity?
Mm-hmm.
I.e., is there a third child relaxation that happens with them too?
That's a great question. We did look at that, so that's when in all of those models, I just wanted to show you kind of the broad patterns. But yeah, we accounted for female age, female size. So was it just females that showed up on the colony with more resources to start with were the ones that were able to be more flexible because they had more to spread around? And none of that tracked out. Basically, ID was really the only thing that was driving the patterns that we saw. And so that again kind of shows you that when you start taking out all these other variables, and this is the only thing that's left, it really is this individual difference, and that not every seal is a seal. Yeah.
So how long is the gestation period, and how long do they have to build up their fat stores before going back on land and repeating the whole process?
Yep, so gray seals, like most pinnipeds, go through a period called embryonic diapause. So after they copulate and they go back to sea, the egg doesn't actually implant for a number of months. So usually about 3 months, and then their gestation is 9 months. And so that's actually how they keep these cycles of every year coming back to breed at the same time of the year. So they have basically a whole year. They have 3 months to kind of build resources before they're also gestating. And then once they start gestating, it's kind of that trade-off of building and building a pup. But that winter period for a lot of pinnipeds that breed in the summer is critical. For these guys, because they breed in the late fall, that kind of spring into summer period is really critical, because that's when they're gestating and trying to bulk up the resources for that fast. And so some females skip a year, but largely they don't really, they're almost never not pregnant once they hit adult. Yeah.
Would you be willing to argue that the animal's reactions to Rocky and to you indicate a level of personality that we expect and see from like our pets? Or is it wrong to look at them as having personalities? Or what lessons do we have to learn about viewing animals, wild animals, with their own individual personalities?
No, that's a great question. And as somebody who has a reactive dog who loves barking at everyone, it's hard not to draw the parallels, and that there are some situations where, again, outside of breed, outside of maybe upbringing, that some individuals seem to just be more responsive to their environments, and others aren't. And so I think in that sense, these types of studies on personality, especially when they started up, they've been able to demonstrate this in a slew of different animals. I mean, we're talking about like anemones have shown consistency, in how they move to startle, if they've been poked, how far they move away from the noxious stimuli, that sort of thing. So it's been shown that it's pretty consistent across all species, that there are these individual differences in behaviors. I think for me, the takeaway is to understand that as we're thinking about management and conservation, it's so easy to just say, there's enough seals. The population is fine. There's enough seals. But as we've kind of heard throughout this week, maybe the amount isn't as important. It's how many of that population will be able to deal with whatever the next stressor is. Because we could go from a really healthy population to a really not healthy population really quickly. And so being able to understand that maybe just our very quantitative way of assessing management needs to be reevaluated.
Could you give us any insight on how Rocky was born, like what Rocky was going to look like, how to determine what sound, volume, the balance of disturbing other seals versus that mom, and the fun parts, the bad parts?
Yeah, so one thing I've learned about doing marine science or science in general is that you have to be a little crazy, and it's not a bad thing if you have like an engineering or an electrical engineering background, or you like tinkering. So I didn't actually build Rocky, my PhD supervisor did, but he was somebody who was always interested in remote controlled cars and was good with electrical systems. And so we were trying to think of a way to provide this very standardized stimulus to the seals that we could get through this rugged terrain, drive it up from a distance, and have it be a set distance from the animal itself. And so it was named Rocky because the first shell it had was actually we put like all this polyfoam on it and like painted it gray so it would look more like a rock with wheels that is clearly moving. So we weren't trying to necessarily hide it from the seals, but just maybe to have it blend in a little and not look as visually stimulating as the sound was. And the idea for the sound was that, again, we wanted to play something that would elicit a response, elicit a potential stress response or a disturbance response, but not be something that was too entirely outside of their kind of known sphere. So we didn't want to start playing like Backstreet Boys at them or something. Wolves have been basically hunted out of the UK for the last hundreds of years, but it's a natural enough sound that it was something that we thought would kind of elicit maybe something that sounds more familiar within their environment, but still would kind of have that startle response. And so that's really where that came from. And I know that since then, there's so many examples of how technology has changed. Dara was talking about, how drones are just changing the game for a lot of marine science and being able to get those aerial views. There's drones that have petri dishes on them that can collect samples from whale blow to do physiological studies. There's all these different things. Our idea for the Fitbits, we started with ones that you had to it was paired to a watch, similar to the ones that we have. And so you'd have to sneak up through the colony and put the the watch within, I think it was 50 feet of the seal. So you're like creeping through, like belly crawling, trying to get the watch near enough to the seal so that it would receive the data. And then technology changed around us, and there's now these kind of heart rate monitors that you could put on an entire team of athletes and monitor 11 athletes running around on a field at the same time. Well, that sounded great to us. We could equip it on 11 seals, be 250 meters up a cliff so that we definitely weren't disturbing them. And so once they were handled, we basically could go back to our hands-off behavioral observations and get both behavior and physiological data on a number of seals at the same time. So as technology changes, our ability to answer new questions is really going to just go crazy.
So on the idea of like maternal vigilance, especially in the gray seals that you looked at, has there been a literature review in comparisons to what we consider potentially maternal vigilance in like land-dwelling mammals, like great apes or anything like that?
I'm not aware of if there have been. I know that this concept of kind of mothering styles and winners and losers has been looked at broadly because it gets back to these questions of why do we see, even within pinnipeds, why do we see these two different strategies of the ones that we're all in for 4 to 18 days and then you're on your own, goodbye, versus no, we're gonna stay with you for a year to 2 years to 3 years, sometimes in case of walrus. Actually, I think there's one case of a stellar sea lion that nursed her young for about 6 years, kept coming back, even while she was having other pups. So why do you see those differences? Why are females choosing, and again, I use the word choosing, they're not actively making these choices. Why are they allocating their resources in these different ways? Why are these behaviors manifesting? So if there hasn't been a literature review yet, it certainly would be interesting to look at, but I'm just not aware of it.
Great. Looks like there's no more questions. So if you could all join me in thanking Amy one more time.